It is Monday, May 24th. I'm Sam Cedar.
And I'm Lucy Steiner. Which one of these stories will you be talking about today?
The far-right dictator of Belarus used a fighter jet and a fake bomb threat to force down a civilian airliner, allowing him to arrest a journalist and a dissident who was on board. Meanwhile, Israel's violence against Gaza is still having ripple effects after a ceasefire, as health officials report hospitals overwhelmed with wounded civilians. Lastly, the Biden administration finally granted temporary protected status to thousands of Haitian immigrants living in the U.S., shielding them from deportation back to a country that is dealing with both a political crisis and a brutal COVID epidemic.
You're listening to Majority.fm's AM Quickie, and these are the stories you need to know.
Belarus's dictator, Aleksandr Lukashenko, carried out a shocking abduction of a journalist on Sunday using a fighter jet and a fake bomb plot to force down a civilian airliner carrying the dissident and then arresting him on the ground. On Sunday, dissident journalist Roman Protasevich was on a Ryanair flight from Greece to Vilnius, Poland, where he had been living in exile. Protasevich is the 26-year-old former editor of Nexta, a channel on the Telegram app that has become one of Belarus's largest opposition media companies. The flight passed through Belarusian airspace, at which point Belarusian air traffic control claimed there was a bomb threat on board. Lukashenko then used that as a pretext to personally order MiG-29 fighter jets up to force the plane to land in Minsk, although it was, by that time, far closer to its destination of Vilnius, this according to the BBC. After 7 hours on the tarmac in Minsk, the flight eventually made it to Vilnius. But Protasevich was not on board. He had already been abducted by Belarusian agents when the plane was forced to land. One passenger on the flight told AFP, quote, "He was not screaming, but it was clear that he was very much afraid. It looked like if the window had been open, he would have jumped out of it." End quote. Protasevich reportedly told other passengers that he was facing the death penalty. Lukashenko has, in recent months, brutally repressed protests against his authoritarian rule, but has been staunchly defended by the Russian government and faced little to no consequence for his policies. European governments in the U.S. have strongly denounced the shocking hijacking, but it's unclear what concrete action they can or actually will take. Prior sanctions on the Lukashenko regime have clearly done little to dampen his brazen authoritarianism. Israel agreed to stop its outright bombardment of the Gaza Strip on Friday, but the aftershocks of its brutal campaign of violence are still shaking the captive population there. According to the Washington Post, Gaza's hospitals are starting to experience a new wave of COVID cases as Israel's bombardment forced many residents into close-packed bomb shelters. Those cases are in addition to the 1,900 people who were injured directly by Israel's bombing. To make matters worse, Post reports that an airstrike destroyed the only lab in Gaza that was doing PCR tests for COVID. All of this is even more outrageous when you consider the disparities between Israel and Gaza's access to the vaccine. Outside of the Strip, Israel has conducted one of the most successful vaccination campaigns in the world. But inside Gaza, only 2% of the population have been vaccinated. Much of this shortage is thanks in part to the Israeli blockade that stops medical supplies from getting through to people there. Even before the recent bombardment, Gaza's ICUs were completely swamped. The country has only 60 ICU beds for a population of almost 2 million. The International Red Cross said that damage inflicted by Israel during the conflict cut water supplies in Gaza by 40% and had cut power to 700,000 Gazans at one point or another. Lest we forget, all of this damage is intentional. Israel knows what will happen when it drops its bombs. And even though it claims to be targeting Hamas, it's Gaza's citizens who suffer the most.
Majority.fm's AM Quickie is fueled by JustCoffee.coop. Just Coffee is a worker-owned coffee roaster based in Madison, Wisconsin that has sponsored the Majority Report for nearly a decade. Check out their collection of fair trade roasts, including our own Majority Report blend. And regardless of what you order, receive 10% off your order when you use the code MAJORITY at checkout. And all shipping is free. That's coupon code MAJORITY at JustCoffee.coop.
Some good news from the Biden administration. Biden's head of the DHS announced on Saturday that Haitians living in the U.S. would be extended temporary protected status, reversing Trump-era efforts to deport them or force them out of the country. Some 150,000 Haitians have been living in the U.S. since the devastating 2010 earthquake, and recent political crises and pandemic there have only made their predicament more dire. Alejandro Mayorkas, the head of the DHS, acknowledged that the country's recent plight has made it all the more important to offer these people shelter. The temporary protected status order will last for 18 months and is a continuation of the policies the Obama administration started for Haitians after the 2010 earthquake. The New York Times reports that it originally stems from a 1990 law that allowed foreigners who had to flee their homes because of natural disasters and conflict to work and live in the United States. This decision is far from fixing the disastrous trend of U.S. immigration policy, but it will certainly be a welcome relief for thousands of Haitians fearing for their lives and their livelihoods. The U.S. was founded to offer refuge for the needy, and policies like this are the least we can do to live up to that ideal. Some more good news for the coronavirus watch in the U.S. Our cases are down to their lowest rate since last summer, with fewer than 30,000 new cases a day. That's still a lot, but at least 50% of Americans have gotten at least one dose of the vaccine now, so we should see those numbers continue to drop.
And now for some quicker quickies.
Quicker quickie.
Some more good news for the coronavirus watch in the U.S. Our cases are down to their lowest rate since last summer, with fewer than 30,000 new cases a day. That's still a lot, but at least 50% of Americans have gotten at least one dose of the vaccine now, so we should see those numbers continue to drop. The chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Jack Reed, said on Sunday that he supports assigning independent prosecutors to sexual assault cases in the military, cutting out that role that unit commanders have played in investigating their own troops. Shareholders at Tribune Publishing, the company that owns the Chicago Tribune and many other newspapers, approved a sale of the company to Alden Global Capital, one of the most bloodthirsty vulture capital funds that has been destroying newspaper chains across the country, and yet another blow to the greater journalism industry. In news that should surprise no one, GOP Senator Rand Paul has announced he will not get the COVID vaccine. Well, what can we say? I guess the only thing that Rand is afraid of is that neighbor who beat the crap out of him a few years back, and not a deadly pandemic. A smart guy, that Rand.
Quicker quickie.
That's all for the AM Quickie. Join us this afternoon at noon live for the Majority Report or later as a podcast.